This attack was one again for the critical infrastructure, the predominantly energy infrastructure around the country being targeted. Not so successful as previously, but we also need to understand that this attack was the first big attack after the months of more or less calmness and smaller missiles used against Ukraine. Plus, they used approximately 81 different type of missiles that also demonstrate the capacities of the Russian strikes as for now, because they use something like 5 or 6 different types of the missiles, including 6 Kinzhal. And what is interesting that is very rare missiles. Russians didn't have a lot of them. And the previous year, they used the same amount as they used during this night. So that demonstrates that each time for such a big attack, they are accumulating efforts and accumulating those missiles that they can use. Plus, Iranian Shahed drones. Again, this night they were used.
Pavel, what was the point of these strikes?
Well, officially, it was announced in Moscow that these were reprisals for an alleged Ukrainian-led so-called partisan raid in Bryansk Oblast, which Russia described as a terrorist attack, and the Ukrainian authorities says they didn't have anything to do with it. So this was some kind of reprisal, mostly again targeting Ukrainian power grid infrastructure, where apparently the Russian very long already campaign of such attacks rather failed, because the power grid in Ukraine has managed to continue and the Ukrainians have managed to cover up their losses, and the power grid is functioning. So in the strategically it didn't work, but tactically, yes, it's a spectacular attacks.
Spectacular attacks, Patrick. Do you agree with that? What's the strategy here as you see it from the Russians using all these different types of missiles, including these hypersonic missiles?
Well, of course, the use of the hypersonics and the different missile systems is to try to get around an increasingly capable air defense suite that Ukraine has. And obviously, we've seen them hitting higher being able to target higher percentage of Russian missiles than they were, say, in the early stages, or were steadily getting better because the new systems are coming in, whether it's this Gepard or the Patriot system, etc., etc. They're getting slowly, but getting a layered air defense system. So using more advanced missiles, using fired from different kinds of platforms with different trajectories, just makes it more difficult to track everything and take it down. The strategy, look, I think the reprisal thing is definitely accurate, but I also think, what we see is a pattern here. Basically, Russia suffers a setback, and then it unleashes a series of barrage attacks, and that's been going on since last summer. You remember the attacks when they started off on shopping centres, etc., right through to the concerted campaign against critical national infrastructure over the winter to try and put the pressure on Ukrainians, and a sort of amounting to what would be comparable to a strategic bombing campaign, say, in the Second World War. The point is, these campaigns don't work. There's no evidence to suggest, apart from a local level, that the population's morale has changed for the worse. There's no evidence to suggest that. Why would you, if you were getting bombed, then go, oh yeah, okay, let's give up? It just doesn't work like that. You go, no, I want to kill them.
Hannah, I mean, you are there. Do you agree with Patrick that this does nothing to change the morale in the Ukraine? I mean, it must, at the very least, be absolutely terrifying for people.
Definitely, that is terrifying. Try to spend your night in the shelter or with the sounds. Trust me, you would not like it. But the question is that we are living with this for the whole year. And it is the psychology of people you used to all the difficulties that you can have. That's one thing. With this type of attacks, the situation is absolutely the same. First of all, you cannot be prepared for this. You don't know which region can be targeted. Today we had Odessa, Lviv, Zhytomyr, so all around the country. At the same time, really, we were worrying in the beginning of the winter with all these attacks against the critical infrastructure, because when it is cold, -10, -15 without electricity and heating, that's difficult. But we survived this winter, both because we bought all the diesel generators, other types of the power banks, so all the additional supply that allowed the small business and big companies to work and households to work. At the same time, spring came. So definitely that's easier. You're not afraid of being cold, for example. And people just looked at this and definitely becoming just more angry. But at the same time, anger is probably not the best term that Ukrainians feel against Russians and against these attacks. Disgust, that's something that all people are discussing. Tiredness and disgust, like to the cucarachas, when you're coming to the old house. They are coming and you're fighting and fighting, but you understand that one day you are winning.
Pavel, these attacks, just to stay with them for one more moment, these attacks, they did strike the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and they've taken it offline. That is considered to be extremely worrying by the rest of the world, by the IAEA especially. Does Russia see that as a victory?
Well, victory would be that if the Ukrainians agreed to a kind of, if not a peace agreement, a ceasefire based on more or less the line of control as it is right now, accepting Russian advances and Russian taking over parts of Ukraine. That's not happening. That was most likely the hope of this whole campaign as it began to deprive the Ukrainians of power grid during the winter. It didn't work out as it was intended because, well, these missiles, well, quite a number is landing, but if compared to how many Americans could send, say, cruise missiles, well, this is not very much. And most of the missiles that are being used were basically designed originally as delivery systems of nuclear weapons. And when they carry conventional ones, well, they're not as effective, just simply they're not as accurate, because when you're using nuke, you don't really need that much accuracy. I mean, in any war with NATO, as the Russian General Staff was planning, a massive use of nuclear weapons was envisaged, and then the number of such attacks would have been really deadly. But then, again, this is not a nuclear war. This is a war, if not with NATO, it's a war by proxy. And this thing is not working. And Syria such missiles were also massively used, but they were kind of just an addition. Mostly it was Russian bombers hanging overhead and bombing. Here they can't because the Ukrainian air defenses are too good for that. And the Russian Air Force is not good enough. So this is not really working strategically as it was intended.
OK, well, let's zone in then, Pavel, on the battlefield and look at Bakhmut, where perhaps one could argue that Russia is having some more success. We've seen the Wagner Group claim control of the eastern part of the city. How likely is it, Pavel, do you think, that the group is going to take the whole city in the coming days?
Well, the Ukrainian command and political leadership apparently decided to hang on in Bakhmut. Apparently, what's happening there right now on the ground is that the Ukrainians retreated behind the line of the Bakhmutka River, which is a narrow but with rather steep banks river. They blew up several bridges, and that it more or less divides the city in half. And that's a reasonable position to take to continue defensive action. So that means taking half doesn't mean they'll take all very soon.
Okay.
Right now, there's something of a pause there, as I understand.
A pause, but it has been a battle of attrition, hasn't it, with huge losses on both sides. Hannah, why is Zelensky refusing to pull forces out of Bakhmut? Even as it was reported, it does appear that his top military commander suggested that they should retreat.
We have this news only in the foreign media. We don't have the confirmation that the commanders asked to be retreat. So that is, let's say, we don't know what is the truth here. But in general, we need to understand that Russians are trying to take the city since July. And that was very important for drawing their forces out, meaning that they're losing a lot of forces, a lot of equipment and ammunition there. That is good for us because they cannot advance and they are losing there. At the same time, strategically, you're right, this city maybe is not so important, but psychologically, that could be very important for the Russian Federation because they can prove that since July they got at least some town. And we need to understand that Bakhmut is quite a small town, 20,000 people. It's like a big village in Ukraine. It was a symbolic city. There are nothing important in it, historical and salt mines, wherever, but not from the military point of view. But as the symbol, we called it the fortress Bakhmut because of all those attacks happening from there, those battles. That's why definitely the forces as for now are standing. Plus, that's allowed not to allow Russians to go ahead because we understand that Mr. Putin announced his desire to occupy completely the Donetsk region. We already heard several deadlines that he put for his forces. Each time it's not happening. So it is ruining the strategic plans of the Russian Federation as well.
Patrick, what do you think about this battle for Bakhmut? As Hannah points out, it's been going on for many, many months, huge losses on both sides, but it is much more symbolic than strategic.
7 months now. Yes, I think so. Look, obviously, political reasons, Russia needs a win, and therefore this was the place it was going to be. And again, it would have given them more control of Donetsk and potentially be under their control if there was a negotiated settlement. There's the internal politics thing between Prigozhin and the Russian military, and he said he'll take it, so he's got a lot of interest to do so. The Russian military also keen to undermine him and take it themselves. You've also got because it's gone on so long and sucked in so many people, and so many people have been killed, maybe 30,000 Russians. You're going to be in the thousands of Ukrainians at least. There's a blood sacrifice there, and when there's blood capital being expended, there is then political capital which comes with that. Yeah, the fortress Bakhmut, it suddenly becomes a bit more important than it was, like Verdun in the First World War. You know, ils ne passeront pas is what the French said. That's because they lost so many people. Unfortunately, it's a sort of reverse psychology. That doesn't mean you should kill more people because you've lost so many people, as I know from serving in Afghanistan. But nevertheless, I think really what's going on here, if you zoom out, what this is about, I would view this as a shaping operation by the Ukrainians. That means they're trying to set the conditions using this operation for other operations. What are they trying to do? We know that they've got a defensive advantage in Bakhmut. They're at least killing 3 times the amount of Russians for every one they lose. It could be up between 5 and 7, yeah? And therefore, it's in their interest to continue this battle as long as they can do so without getting a lot of forces encircled or cut off. Yeah, what they're trying to do is drain Russia and keep Russia attacking them at a place of their choosing. And that means that Russia is not actually going onto the defensive. Its focus is on taking Bakhmut. And that makes a lot of sense for Ukraine right now.
So, Pavel, what's your response to that in Bakhmut, the idea or the thought is, the estimate is that 3 to 5 Russians are being lost for every Ukrainian. Are you hearing those sort of numbers in Russia? Is that common knowledge in Russia?
Well, it's very hard to say because both sides are not publishing their actual numbers of casualties and who's losing more. I would assume that it's kind of more or less equal, most likely. Like in the mentioned Battle of Verdun in 1916, actually the defending French lost more than the attacking Germans. But basically it was more or less the same, but they lost a bit more. But it's highly symbolic. If Bakhmut falls, that's a great moral booster for the Russians and for the Kremlin in internal politics. And apparently military considerations are taking second kind of place here for both sides. It's a battle of wills like Stalingrad, like Verdun, a meat grinder, actually, and the military considerations are secondary.
How significant, Pavel, is it for the Wagner boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, to have this victory? He's becoming a very powerful voice on the battlefield and certainly is quick to criticize the Kremlin, the defense ministry, if he does not feel he's getting enough support. How significant is he becoming?
Well, he's very significant. He has a private army that has dramatically expanded during the last year. from several thousand deployed somewhere in Syria or in the Central African Republic or I don't know where, to tens of thousands of fighters with his own tanks and artillery. And he's close personally to Vladimir Putin, and he's publicly attacking the defense minister and the defense ministry, his second in command, General Gerasimov. So he's a very vocal political figure in Russia, with his own private army fighting out there and with connections in the Kremlin, and he's financing it. So for him, it's a very high importance thing to take over Bakhmut. And for the defense ministry, most likely they don't want him to take over Bakhmut and get the laurels of victory, because he's their political opponent. So there's a lot of infighting happening there on the Russian side.
Patrick, when you look at this infighting happening between the Wagner Group and the Defence Ministry, do you see it posing a problem for Russia in presenting a united front against Ukraine?
I think that goes without saying. You know, you don't want a large mercenary army at odds with your army. But listen, Russia's had problems with command and control and leadership since day one of this war. So it's par for the course at this stage, you know. I think really, you know, the issue with Bakhmut, and like, where do they go if they take Bakhmut? Say they fall, right? So the land to the west of Bakhmut, directly west, is on a higher ground, easier to defend. The two roads which lead northwest and southwest, the northwest one's to Kramatorsk-Sloviansk. You know, there'll be defensive lines around there. There'll be defensive lines around Kramatorsk. It doesn't change the calculus that much, you know. So therefore, my view on this, again, strategically, this is about reserves. Yeah, it's about draining combat power. If Ukraine can get through this, you know, grinding attritional warfare without committing the reserves which it needs to keep back and intact for the summer, where it's going to try and attack in probably one or two places, that's a victory for Ukraine. Russia is trying to take this in a meat grinder effect. It does have some uncommitted reserves as far as we understand. But the chances of them being able to conduct a breakout and then take vast swathes of Ukrainian territory is questionable, to say the least. So it's really about reserve, manpower, and an eye on the future campaigns coming in the summer, late spring.
OK, I just want to touch as well on the idea of peace talks, because they really don't seem to be on the agenda at the moment. Hannah, we've just had the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in Kyiv. No mention of peace talks by him, only discussing grain and accessibility of grain to the rest of the world. Is it on anyone's minds to get Russia and Ukraine to the same table?
There are different proposals coming. Just recently, China expressed their position. The question is, the talks is just the instrument. It is not the ultimate goal. The question is what we are going to discuss at these negotiations. And here we see that the Russian position has not changed since March last year, when we had these negotiations. At that time, there were much higher chances to find some compromise or concessions from two sides. That's what we have after the year of those first Belarus and then Istanbul negotiations. That's why the United Nations in general, Secretary General, took very low profile during this invasion, let's be honest. And as for now, for him, the grain deal is the most important. Now, this March, it should be yet one prolongation, and we are not so sure that Russia would allow this prolongation. That's why he is trying now to negotiate this. Plus the nuclear security, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that you talked earlier, and in general, the nuclear security of all Ukrainian nuclear power plants. That's also about what United Nations is talking, humanitarian aid, some stuff like this, but they're not ready to propose anything more than this. And looks like the United Nations, as the Secretariat, is more waiting for others to propose their ideas.
Russia, Pavel, where would those proposals come from? We've had something produced from China, the 12-point peace plan, that's been sort of dismissed quite widely as more of a set of principles rather than a plan. What else? Where else could we get ideas from?
Well, the Russian Kremlin says that they had the same proposals as last March. Basically, they would agree for some kind of freezing of the situation, a permanent ceasefire based on more or less the line of control, with some maybe negotiations here and there, kind of quid for pro quo or something, which Ukraine is not accepting, and the West also is not accepting, at least present Western governments, though Donald Trump says that he could achieve peace very swiftly and most likely, again, on Russian terms, as said, on the ceasefire on the line, more or less on the line of control. So that means the positions of these parties are miles apart. Russia also more or less, though they praised the Chinese proposal, they said that the Kremlin said right now it's not practical because there's no one to negotiate with in Kiev, which means that before there are decisive action in the coming late spring, summer military campaign, which can change the facts on the ground. The facts on the ground may change or may not. And already on the basis of that, somewhere in the summer, beginning in the autumn, there can be negotiations on finding something to kind of, legalize the new situation on the ground as it is by then.
Okay.
So right now we're looking forward for a big fight.
Patrick, I can see you nodding there. Do you envision peace talks by the end of this year? What will the situation on the battleground have to be like for that to take place?
I think Pavel's exactly right there. You know, that it's about fighting, not talking now, and the results of that will inform any chance of talking. So there will be, I'd imagine, a window of opportunity come the autumn, winter. But there's an interesting thing about timing here. You know, as Pavel mentioned, Donald Trump's statements, who knows if he'll be the president or not, but there is an election at the end of 2024, a very important one in the United States, of which United States policy could change. There is a section of the Republicans that said that the US is essentially too involved in Ukraine. That will be weighing heavily on Ukrainian timescales, I would have thought. Secondly, Russia, if it holds on, it has an advantage in manpower, an advantage in being able to produce dumb weapons like artillery. And over time, on the current trajectory, that may favour their outcome. So I think there's an awareness essentially that Ukraine wants to first of all do as best it can this summer and see where it is afterwards. And it doesn't really need to be or want to be in a long-term battle, war with Russia, because it may start to favour Russia. Again, you've got the whole point about Western commitment to it, which so far has been great in terms of European commitment, very strong. But could that waver again? It just the variables get a bit more unknowable as the longer Ukraine pushes this out. So I think there will be a window, hopefully in the autumn. I wouldn't rule out, unfortunately, depending on what happens on the battlefield, a frozen conflict through escalation, because we've seen that happen previously, for example, in Korea when nuclear powers are involved. So I think there's a lot obviously to play for, and we don't have full clarity, of course.
Hannah, just the last thought going to you. The longer this drags on, as Patrick says, how concerned are Ukrainians about wavering Western support?